Hey guys, we are back to do some Q&A questions on the first episode of House of the Dragon. So here we go. Do you think that there is room for these characters' ideologies to grow and change? Rhaenys' strong opinion on gender roles in the pilot could be seen as a starting point for her character's beliefs that will be challenged when her own children are pulled into the conflict. We perceive these characters as static because we've read their whole arcs, but on the personal scale of the show, there is room for them to be dynamic. Just look at how much depth Viserys was given. So for the most part, I would say the characters in the source material were not given much personality at all, so in a sense they are rather blank slates. I mean, some characters we are simply told their personalities, Rhaenys being said to be adventurous, but it's all tell not show. She never acts particularly adventurous. Some characters have ice and fire parallel characters to look to, such as Otto to Tywin, Viserys to Robert, or Daemon to Oberyn, but even then it's a loose correlation. The characters generally have very few lines of dialogue, like fewer than 5 lines apiece, and from what's given, we aren't even sure of the veracity. With Rhaenys in particular, her character is generally only portrayed as intelligent and angry. With good reason, but that's it. She's mad when she's passed over, and she has some lines about that, and then much later she gives some solid military analysis on the Black Council and goes off to fight in battle bravely. So really, sky's the limit. Anything is possible with her. Viserys was definitely improved upon, so we may see some great Rhaenys character in the future. And when it comes to Rhaenys' lines during the tourney, let's be real on what's going on here. The episode centers around the other characters: Daemon, Viserys, Rhaenyra, Alicent, Aemma, Otto. Rhaenys needed some lines desperately, so they gave her some exposition on the state of Westeros having a long peace, and wanted to make Rhaenys sound sassy because we associate sassiness with strength. That was all there was to it. Corlys is also given some lines that don't fit his personality at all. He complains about violence when he's literally trying to start a war in the Stepstones. The scene was merely there for screen time and background. It's kind of like that scene between Tyrion and Theon in the first season of Game of Thrones, where Theon recommends a brothel to Tyrion and Tyrion randomly berates and mocks Theon. The scene makes no sense, it doesn't fit with either of their personalities, but it gives Theon some screen time and we get exposition and history on the Ironborn. Keep in mind, according to the source material, Rhaenys literally does nothing for the next 2 decades except attend tourneys, weddings, and funerals. So the writers were trying to give the woman something before the dance. Do you feel like Otto is taking a huge risk when asking Alicent to be with Viserys? He's still completely distraught over the 2 deaths. Sending your daughter to him could be seen as an insult to the memory of the queen and the prince. Additionally, Alicent is the best friend of his daughter. Even in medieval times, was it common to marry/bed someone who you have a somewhat fatherly relationship with? So obviously with this scene we have a rather large divergence from the source material. So in the book, 1, Alicent is much older than Rhaenyra. 2, Alicent's kindness was seen by Viserys when taking care of Jaehaerys and not Viserys himself. 3, we have no idea if Viserys even liked Aemma Arryn. And 4, Viserys and Alicent may have been having an affair prior to Aemma's death, that is, prior to the tragedy, so it's kind of all a big different situation. But going with the show, I would say that Otto has been observing Viserys for a decade now and knows his personality pretty well. When tragedy strikes, Viserys apparently becomes lonely, but also pushes away those he loves. This may seem like a contradiction, but I actually know people like this, so it seems real to life to me. Alicent coming to Viserys when Otto knew Rhaenyra and Daemon would be pushed away by the king is simply Otto knowing the man. Of course, it would be super awkward if they got it wrong and Alicent knocked on the door only to find Rhaenyra in the room helping her dad with his miniatures, but whatever. One other thing to note is that Viserys is kind of into drinking, and we get some lines about how he and Rhaenyra were inseparable because she was his cupbearer. In the show, we get hints of this, with Viserys playfully teasing Rhaenyra that she needs to do her duty, when literally no one is drinking at the table but Viserys. And drunk people, especially emotionally unstable drunk people, well, they get ideas. Many of them, not great. If Viserys takes Alicent's virginity, he may feel socially obligated to marry her, as Book Robb did with Jane Westerling. It's clear that Otto and Mellos are working together just from this episode alone. Could the Oldtown conspiracy actually be revealed as real on this show? So I would agree that it's abundantly clear in this episode that Otto and Mellos are working together. They practically finish each other's sentences. And weirdly, Lionel Strong, an Otto Hightower crony in the book, is out of the loop, which is certainly interesting. Harwin and Larry Strong are also absent at this point when they were likely involved in the Heir for a Day incident in the Rogue Prince material, so I'm not sure what they're doing with the Strongs, the hosts of the Council of 101 and huge players, and we have nothing about the Septons or the Faith of the Seven when that's a huge part of the storming of the Dragon Pit. But with regards to the Maesters specifically, I would say there's definitely going to be an Oldtown conspiracy of some sort. They kept in the scene where Otto sends his letter to Oldtown, and the Hightowers are described as the defenders of the Citadel when they bend the knee to Rhaenyra, when other titles like Lord of the Port are not mentioned. I tend to think they would not have thrown that line in if it weren't relevant. So yes, a Maester conspiracy, but there is a question to what level of a Maester conspiracy. It might just be an anti-Daemon conspiracy or a pro-Hightower conspiracy, rather than a full anti-Dragon or anti-Targaryen conspiracy. Though I will say there is some evidence that the plot is heading towards an anti-Dragon conspiracy. The Maesters are clearly displayed as the presenters of the decision at the Council of 101, so it seems like there was an anti-Rhaenys bias to the Maesters for some reason. And one can't really argue it's sexism because later they act pro-Rhaenyra. This doesn't necessarily mean that dragons and bloodlines are the reason, but there does seem to be something larger. That said, maybe the show will just have everything in the background, something for fans to debate with no real answers. After all, in Game of Thrones, we never really got clear answers about time travel, the Three-Eyed Raven, Jon's resurrection, the return of dragons, Quaithe, the seasons, or prophecy. This could end up being the same thing. Do you think they'll give sapphic undertones to Rhaenyra and Alicent's relationship? How do you think this could change the story? Love you, Preston. Well, I actually think they already have given a lesbian undertone to the relationship, and I have seen lesbian and bisexual fans say that they sense it too. And of course, Emma Darcy, a non-binary actor, will be playing Rhaenyra later on, so it's difficult not to at least think about this. Of course, it's certainly possible that everyone is imagining this, but it is still HBO. But going off of just this episode, I think there is a subtle hint that Rhaenyra fancies Alicent unrequitedly, with the largest clue being that Rhaenyra says that she wants to fly together with Alicent on Dragonback and explore the world, while Alicent has already said she's not interested in flying. The adventurous nature of Rhaenyra wanting to explore the world on Dragonback could have just as easily been communicated without the "with you" in there. The two girls having different desires makes me think they have different desires. It's also a rather clever spin on the source material. In Fire and Blood, Rhaenyra is presented with no fewer than 6 different men who she may have been having sex with. There's Criston Cole, Daemon Targaryen, Harwin Strong, Laenor Velaryon, Carl Corey, and Mushroom. And likewise, her fancying or being spurned by men is given as the motivation for all sorts of events. It would be funny if everyone got it wrong and the true source of the Blacks and Greens feud was Alicent spurning Rhaenyra, something that no one saw coming. You know, like the Jon and Cat feud being because they actually fucked. It seems such a contradiction to me that the episode is so adamant that a female cannot be named heir. Aerea Targaryen was heir to both Maegor and Jaehaerys, i.e. half of the Targaryen kings before Viserys had a female heir, albeit temporarily. Is the show and George R. Martin being inconsistent, or do you think it's just to prove succession is messy and changeable? It certainly is a contradiction. However, George R. Martin definitely understands that succession is messy and changeable, but I think the real issue is that George R. Martin also believes that history itself is messy and changeable. And I think the source of the contradiction when adapting the show is partly the fault of George R. Martin and his retconning, and partly due to adapting biased source material that is either lying or reinterpreting history. So with regard to the retconning, the Dance of the Dragons began conceptually as just a brother versus sister story to kill off dragons and establish a male-only rule. And the male-only rule is a big deal when we consider the Dornish story. Aerian's queen-making adventure began as a direct parallel to this original concept of the dance. Rhaenyra, a sister who is a year older, is usurped by Aegon, a boy, because of the kingmaker Criston Cole, while Myrcella, a sister who is a year older, usurps Tommen, the boy, with Arianna playing the role of queenmaker. Originally, Criston Cole simply created male-only rule in 129, likely because that's what Westerosi did. Meanwhile, Aerion was going to undo it in 300 because that's what Dornish did. This was a fairly simple history. Then George threw everything out the window thematically and wrote the rather complicated Princess and the Queen and the Rogue Prince, and invented the Council of 101 to give more support to Criston Cole's notion. Not that he needed it at all. And then he made the story written from the biased perspective of the Maesters who supported the Greens. Reading the material, the Council of 101 is made out to be a big deal by the Maesters. It established precedent, supposedly, though I would actually argue that the Council of 101 did nothing of the sort, as Viserys names Rhaenyra only 4 years after the Council. The Council really established nothing, the Maesters were lying about how important it was, and they retroactively were changing history. And this happens all of the time. For example, no one at the time thought July 4th, 1776 was the birth of a unified American nation-state. The war hadn't been won, the government and the Constitution hadn't even been established yet, and the colonies were rather separate. It was only much later that we get this notion that this was the starting point. In fact, 7 years ago, appearing in the Gettysburg Address was a conscious rewriting of history by Lincoln, focusing on the fact that America was this sort of indivisible ethnic state, independent of the government. Anyway, soon after the Rogue Prince, George writes Sons of the Dragons, detailing Aerea Targaryen and the messy succession. The events told in Sons of the Dragon and the Rogue Prince and Princess of the Queen don't align, and they're not supposed to. It's altered, biased history, and George knows it. But how do you adapt that? As with July 4th, 1776, adaptations of the Founding Fathers always present them like they somehow knew from the beginning that this was going to be a great, unified American nation-state that was going to go forward for hundreds of years and be a beacon of democracy. And this is partly due to some historians portraying the Founding Fathers as these great, near-perfect men with these forward-thinking, fantastic ideas. But it's kind of all hogwash. The Founding Fathers were all different, imperfect people with varying notions of things, many of them contradictory, and they were all making up the rules as they went along. But that's hard to put to page, screen, or stage, especially for a modern audience. It's a lot easier to portray Alexander Hamilton as an abolitionist, something the audience clearly understands, than a sometimes manumissionist. And so that's where we are with history here. The source material has been retconned a few times, so it's messy to begin with, and then it's from the perspective of later biased maesters. So to be fair, the text around these events does say that there's no precedence for women ruling, and the writers are adapting that. Yes, you can riddle out the complicated truth, but that's something only superfans have done, and I'm not sure Grand Maester Mello speaking about the complicated past of Maegor and Aerea Targaryen makes for a good scene. So it is what it is. Doesn't the C-section contradict the lore, given that Qyburn got banned from the Citadel for opening the bodies of the living? Well, this is an interesting topic. Yes, Qyburn's expulsion from the Citadel did seem to be over the idea that he was cutting open bodies of the living, that is, he was conducting surgery on people, and maesters don't do surgery, so no C-sections. Now, there's a number of fans out there that think Lyanna's baby at the Tower of Joy was a C-section baby, with Ned making the same sort of decision that Viserys made, and that's why there's so much blood, and some even go further to say that Ned used Dawn or ice to slice open Lyanna. But there's absolutely no textual evidence of this. In fact, there's no textual evidence of any C-sections at all in Ice and Fire. The closest we get to the idea is a Tyroshi traitor saying that Tyrion clawed his way out of Joanna Lannister's womb, killing her, to which Cersei thinks the idea is nonsense. And this is actually something that George R. Martin gets right about history. In medieval times, there weren't really C-sections. Or if there were, it wasn't recorded. There's a tale involving Henry VIII and Jane Seymour in 1537 where her child is supposedly valued over her life. Supposedly, but that's about it. People have this notion that because today, often the unborn are valued over living women, that in medieval times, when people were treated poorly and everyone was backward and stupid, that it must have been similar. But it actually wasn't like that. In fact, medieval midwives and later doctors would try to save the woman first. They even had procedures for crushing the fetus to get it out, rather than have the woman die. The church itself even gave this direction, with Thomas Aquinas saying, yeah, the woman's life is paramount. So yeah, incredible scene, not historically accurate, and not consistent with Ice and Fire. Like most media, it's mostly about modern society rather than yesterday's society. Glad your show breakdowns are back. Can you explain those balls at the small council meeting? I don't recall them being in the original series. So a lot of people have been asking about the balls. They're not from Game of Thrones, they're not from Ice and Fire, and they're not from medieval history. Carmine and I joke that they're there for two-factor authentication to prevent faceless men from infiltrating a small council meeting. But according to the showrunners, they're simply there to add more ceremony to the small council meetings, and the imagery is supposed to parallel punching in at a job. You know, what factory workers do. And that's all there is to it. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.